Every parent has a moment where they realize their child is repeating words that were never theirs to say. Mine happened over a plate of steak in front of the man my ex-wife married. And by the time the following Sunday rolled around, that same man didn't have a car, didn't have a job, and didn't have anywhere to live. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 47 years old, and I live just outside Portland, Oregon. I built a small freight and logistics company from nothing over the last 18 years. But you'd never guess that by looking at me. I still drive an old work truck. I still wear the same flannel shirts I've worn for a decade. And I never once talked about money in front of my son. My son Ethan is 13. He lives with his mother, Renee, ever since our divorce 3 years ago. Every Sunday, without fail, I take him to dinner. It's the one thing I've never missed. That particular Sunday started like any other. By the end of it, everything had changed. Renee and I were married for 11 years before it fell apart. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a slow drift. I was the quiet type, the guy who worked long hours and came home tired. Renee wanted someone who talked more, showed off more, made her feel like life was exciting. I never blamed her for that. I just never became someone I wasn't to keep her happy. When we split, I made sure Ethan never felt caught in the middle. I paid support on time, every month. I never said a bad word about Renee in front of him, and I showed up every Sunday like clockwork. Renee started dating Vince about a year after the divorce was final. He sold cars at one of the big dealerships off the interstate. According to Ethan, Vince always had a new truck, new clothes, and a story about some deal he just closed. Renee married him 8 months later, and Ethan moved into a nicer rental house on the north side of town. I never said anything negative about Vince to Ethan. Not once, even when Ethan started coming home comparing the two houses. I told myself it didn't matter what my son thought of me, as long as I kept showing up. Looking back, I think that quiet approach is exactly what let a man like Vince walk in 2 years later and start rewriting the story of who the real man in Ethan's life was supposed to be. That Sunday, Renee texted asking if Vince could join dinner. He wanted to get to know me better. I agreed, because I never wanted Ethan feeling tension between the adults in his life. We met at a steakhouse Vince picked, the kind of place with dim lighting and prices that didn't match the food. Vince showed up in a leather jacket, shook my hand a little too hard, and spent the first 10 minutes talking about a truck he'd just leased. Ethan was hanging on every word, laughing at his jokes. Halfway through dinner, talk turned to the week. I mentioned a new shipping contract at work, nothing special. Vince jumped in, bragging about a deal he'd closed, how his manager called him the top guy at the dealership, how he was thinking about a boat for summer. Then, out of nowhere, Ethan looked right at me and said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. "You're a loser, you know that. Vince actually does something with his life." "He's not a loser like you." The table went silent. Renee's face went pale. Vince stared at his plate. A waiter walked by and refilled our water glasses like nothing had happened, and for a second, the clink of the pitcher was the only sound at the table. I could have said a lot of things right then. I could have told Ethan exactly what I do for a living, how many people I employ, what I'm actually worth compared to the man across from him bragging about a leased truck. I could have embarrassed Vince with facts he had no idea I had. I didn't. I just looked at my son and said, "Okay, buddy, let's finish eating." Then I changed the subject to his baseball team. Renee tried to correct Ethan, but it came out weak, like she didn't fully mean it. Vince never said a word. He just sat there looking pleased with himself, like he'd won something. I paid the bill like always, hugged Ethan goodbye, told him I loved him. I drove home in silence, no radio, just my son's voice on repeat in my head. "You're a loser." Vince actually does something with his life. I wasn't angry at Ethan. He's 13, and kids repeat what gets praised around them. But I was done being quiet about certain things. Not to hurt my son, but because I realized I'd let people believe a story about me that wasn't true, and I'd let it sit there far too long. What Ethan didn't know, what Renee didn't know, and what Vince definitely didn't know, was just how much of their comfortable little life was actually connected to me, without any of them realizing it. And that Sunday night, I decided it was time they found out. Here's something I never mentioned at that dinner table or any table. 18 years ago, I started my freight company with one used truck and a loan from my father. By the time Renee and I split, that company was moving freight for warehouses and dealerships across the whole region. I kept it quiet on purpose. I never wanted Ethan growing up thinking money was the point of anything. But here's the part that mattered most. 2 years earlier, before Renee even married Vince, she'd called asking for a favor. Vince had bad credit from old business troubles and needed someone to co-sign a truck loan so he'd have reliable transportation, since he was driving Ethan around sometimes too. I agreed quietly, for Ethan's sake. My name went on that loan as backup signer. Around that same time, a property manager I used for a handful of rentals through a company called Cascade Home Holdings found Renee and Vince a rental on the north side of town. I never asked who the tenants were. Not until months later, when I saw the address on a report and realized exactly whose name was on the lease. And on top of that, the dealership where Vince worked happened to be the same dealership group that handled fleet vehicles for my company, a contract worth real money every year. None of them knew any of it. Not Renee, not Vince, not Ethan. I'd never used any of it, never even thought about using it, until that Sunday night at the steakhouse. I got home a little after 9 and sat in my kitchen without turning on the lights, replaying Ethan's voice. I wasn't planning anything reckless. I want to be clear about that. But I realized that for 2 years, I'd been quietly propping up a man who used that same stability to call me a loser in front of my own son. That didn't sit right with me anymore. The next morning, I called my accountant, Howard, who's handled my books for over a decade, and asked him to pull together everything connected to the co-signed loan and the rental property. I also called Linda, who runs Cascade Home Holdings for me, and asked for the lease details on that house. I wasn't loud on any of those calls. I just started asking questions I probably should have asked a long time ago. By that afternoon, I had a clear picture of every piece and exactly how it could unwind. I sat with it one more night before making a single move because I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting out of anger. By Monday, I knew I wasn't angry anymore. I was just finished. But what happened over the next few days completely changed the course of everything for all of us. Tuesday morning, I called Linda first. I asked what the lease situation looked like. She told me it was actually up for renewal that same week, a one-year term about to roll over automatically unless the owner said otherwise. I told her not to renew it, just send the standard non-renewal notice required by state law. Nothing shady, nothing illegal. Just a property owner deciding not to continue a lease. Renee had no idea the house was connected to me. As far as she knew, they'd found it through a regular listing and never met the actual owner, common enough with management companies. That's exactly why I'd set it up that way, to keep business and personal life separate. Wednesday, I called Howard about the truck loan. He confirmed what I suspected. Vince's credit had never actually recovered the way all his talk suggested. My name being on that loan was the only reason the bank approved it 2 years earlier. Howard explained that if I formally requested removal as co-signer, the lender would re-evaluate based on Vince's credit alone. If he didn't qualify without me, the bank could call the loan due or require immediate refinancing. I told Howard to submit the request that day. This wasn't a loophole. It's just how co-signed loans work. By Thursday morning, the bank had already reached out to Vince directly, telling him his co-signer had been removed and he'd need to pay off the balance or refinance on his own, fast. I found out about that part later. At the time, I just knew the wheels were turning, and I felt no urge to check. Thursday afternoon, I made one more call to Dennis Cole, the owner of the dealership group where Vince worked. Dennis and I had done business for almost 10 years, ever since my company started needing new trucks for our growing fleet. Every year, my freight company placed a large fleet order through his dealership, the kind of steady business that matters a lot to a dealership's yearly numbers. I called just to check in. During the conversation, Dennis mentioned Vince had been struggling lately, missing targets 2 months running, and management was already talking about his performance. I didn't say a word about loans or houses. I didn't need to. I simply mentioned, in a completely calm tone, that with everything going on in my personal life, I was thinking about moving my fleet business to a different dealership group at renewal, one that specialized more in commercial accounts. Dennis asked if there was anything he could do to keep the account. I told him honestly it wasn't about him. It was just time for a change. That conversation put pressure on Vince from a direction he never saw coming. Because dealership management pays close attention to which salesperson is tied to which accounts, and Vince had been quietly riding the reputation of being close to the Marsh account for the better part of a year without either of us realizing the other side of that connection. Dennis called back an hour later, said his sales manager confirmed Vince's numbers hadn't been where they needed to be for a while, account or no account. I hung up and just sat there for a minute, realizing how much of Vince's whole image had been resting on things that were never actually his. If I had known how fast everything was about to unravel, I might have braced myself. I didn't. By Friday, things moved faster than I expected. Ethan called that evening, confused, saying Vince had been on the phone all day looking stressed, and his mom kept insisting everything was fine, even though she clearly wasn't. I kept my voice calm, told him grown-up stuff gets complicated sometimes, and asked about baseball practice instead. I wasn't putting any of this on my son. That same night, Renee texted asking if I'd heard anything about problems with their rental, since she'd gotten a notice about the lease not renewing. I told her I hadn't heard anything true, in the sense that I hadn't heard about her receiving it, even though I knew it was coming. She mentioned how strange the timing was, getting hit with a lease notice and a bank issue with Vince's truck loan in the same week. I told her that sounded stressful and left it there. I want to be honest, sitting on that information felt strange. But I kept remembering that dinner table, my son calling me a loser, while the two adults responsible for raising him said nothing to correct it. So I let the week play out exactly the way it was already moving. Saturday morning, Ethan called me crying, which almost never happens. A tow truck had come early and taken Vince's truck right off the driveway while the neighbors watched. Vince had missed the refinancing window, the loan defaulted, and the lender repossessed the vehicle, standard practice with auto loans everywhere. Ethan said Vince was yelling on the phone in the driveway. His mom was crying in the kitchen, and he didn't understand what was happening. I told Ethan that sometimes when people spend faster than they make, things catch up all at once, and none of it was his to worry about. I told him I loved him, and that whatever was happening with the adults in that house had nothing to do with him. After I hung up, I sat there thinking about how 1 week earlier, that same driveway had Vince's shiny leased truck sitting on it while he bragged about it at dinner. Now it was empty, and the man who called himself successful in front of my son was yelling at a tow truck driver just doing his job. I felt bad for Ethan having to watch that. Genuinely bad. But something told me he was already starting to understand things a lot more clearly than he had a week earlier. By Sunday afternoon, the day I was supposed to pick Ethan up for dinner, Renee called, sounding nothing like her usual confident self. The lease wasn't renewing. They had to be out within the legal notice period. And with Vince's truck gone and his job apparently in trouble too, she didn't know where they'd go. Then she said something that told me she'd finally connected the dots. Linda had mentioned, in passing, that the owner of the house was a company called Cascade Home Holdings. Renee looked it up out of curiosity, and a public filing had my name attached as the registered owner. Her voice cracked when she asked if I owned the house they'd lived in for 2 years. I didn't deny it. I told her the truth, calmly. Yes, I owned it, long before she and Vince ever moved in, and neither Linda nor I had known who the tenants would be until it was already done. She went quiet. Then she asked the question I knew was coming, whether any of it, the lease, the truck, Vince's job trouble, had anything to do with me. I could hear Ethan in the background asking what was wrong, and I could hear the panic under her voice, even as she tried to stay calm for him. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her, standing in a kitchen that wasn't even really hers, her whole world shifting in a single afternoon. But then I remembered that same kitchen, that same family, sitting quietly a week earlier while my son called me a loser to my face. The sympathy only went so far. I told her the truth. I hadn't done anything illegal or sneaky. I'd simply stopped quietly holding up parts of their life that were never supposed to be my responsibility, especially after watching my own son call me a loser while she and Vince said nothing. Renee went silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. She didn't know Vince's loan had my name on it. He'd never told her the full story of how he got approved 2 years back. She hadn't realized the rental connected to me either, and if she had, she never would have let Ethan say what he said without saying something herself. I told her I believed her, and I meant it. Renee has never been a cruel person, just someone who sometimes doesn't look closely enough at the people she trusts. She asked, almost begging, if there was anything I could do, since they now had nowhere to live and Vince's job was falling apart at the same time. I told her honestly that the lease and the loan were already moving through normal legal and financial processes, and I wasn't in a position to reverse things I'd already handed to my accountant and property manager. I told her I was sorry she was scared, but that this had never really been about her. Before we hung up, I told her the one thing I actually cared about saying out loud, that whatever happened between her and Vince from here on, none of it would change a single thing about my Sunday dinners with Ethan. She didn't need to worry about that part at all. I still picked Ethan up that Sunday, because whatever was happening between the adults, I wasn't going to break the one thing that had never wavered in 3 years. We went to a small diner near his school, quieter than the steakhouse, just a booth by the window. Ethan was unusually quiet the whole ride there. Halfway through his burger, he finally asked straight out if the trouble at his mom's house had anything to do with me. I decided he deserved the truth, in a way a 13-year-old could actually understand. I told him that 2 years ago I'd helped Vince get a truck loan because his mom asked me to, and that I also happened to own the house they were renting, though none of us realized the connection until recently. I told him plainly I decided to stop helping with those things after he called me a loser at dinner in front of a man who never once said a word to correct him. Ethan's face went pale. He set his burger down. He said he didn't know any of that, and that he'd only said it because Vince was always talking about deals and bonuses, and it made my quiet, normal life seem boring by comparison. I told him I understood, and that I wasn't mad at him. I told him being loud about money doesn't make someone successful, that showing up every single Sunday for 3 straight years, paying every bill on time, never once saying a bad word about his mother, that was the real measure of a man, even if it never got mentioned at any dinner table. Ethan got quiet again, then he said he was sorry, real quiet, real serious, the kind that actually means something. 3 weeks later, Renee and Ethan moved into a smaller apartment across town, one Renee found completely on her own, with no connection to me or any company I owned. Vince lost his job at the dealership about 10 days after that dinner. Last I heard, he'd moved back in with his own parents a couple states away. Renee didn't go with him. I never gloated about any of it. Not to Renee, not to Ethan, and definitely not to Vince, who I never spoke to again after that steakhouse dinner. Ethan comes to my place every other weekend now instead of just Sunday dinners, an arrangement Renee asked for herself once things settled down. And he's never called me a loser again. Though honestly, I never needed him to take it back for my own sake. I did it so he'd understand something that actually matters, that the quiet, steady people in your life are usually the ones holding everything together, even when nobody's clapping for it. Some nights Ethan and I just sit on my porch after dinner, not talking about much, and that's enough for me. I built my whole life around showing up, not showing off. It just took one loud comment at a dinner table to finally show my own son the difference between the two. Renee and I still talk sometimes about Ethan's school events or doctor appointments, kept simple and respectful, nothing more than what a good co-parenting relationship needs. She never brought up the house or the loan again after that phone call, and honestly, neither did I. So I'll leave you with this. What would you have done if you were sitting at that table and your own kid called you a loser in front of a man who owed you more than he ever knew? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have said something right then and there? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in my shoes. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.